So I'm Sofya. Thank you so much for coming to hear me speak. I'm really sorry that my presentation is going to be in English. I hope that's okay. So I'm Sofya. There's various ways to contact me. I will also be very available after the end of this. So if you want to, exchange contact details, I'll be happy to chat afterwards. And the goal for today is for me to kind of give a brief overview. What is my understanding of biosecurity? Give a brief understanding of my EA journey and my biosecurity journey career so far. I'll talk about my current projects and my next steps. And then I'll also give some advice on navigating the space and the field and how to get involved. If you're not necessarily interested in biosecurity, I think that some of the advice that I give in terms of navigating the field and how to get involved is applicable to other areas as well. So I guess stay tuned for that in general. At any point, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or just interrupt me. And then I'll also save around 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So to get started with my journey and my career so far, so I'm originally Russian. I was born there and lived there for, the first part of my life. I then moved to the UK, and then I studied in the States for my undergrad. So when I was doing my undergrad in the States, the way that the undergraduate system is set up is that you do a number of different subjects, and the tracks that you can go under is, if you do biology and chemistry, the kind of things that you do is you're either a doctor or a professor, or you work in industry for a big pharmaceutical company. Neither of those paths interested me, or I didn't really find it that appealing. So I didn't really know how to apply my degree because the people that I was surrounded with were all kind of working towards one of those paths, which I found somewhat demotivating and somewhat, confusing. So I was looking for alternative things. So at that point, I discovered EA. There was a local EA group, and I joined a few meetings. I was a bit confused. I thought it was quite strange. In general, I wasn't really sure if I fit into effective altruism, and I wasn't really sure how to really apply myself or where that really, where my own skills would fit within biosecurity. I find that somewhat amusing, looking back on it, but I think that I just wasn't really sure, does my degree really apply? Do I have anything relevant to add? Do I have anything meaningful to contribute? So that was definitely something that a lot of self-hesitation or maybe some imposter syndrome that I felt at the beginning. So I worked for MindRock. This was parallel to my studies, so I did some consulting for MindRock, which is an investment firm, and I looked over different startups that they were investing in, and I was trying to evaluate the science for them. So they had a financial background, but they didn't have the kind of scientific background to see, is this invention that someone or is this pitch deck that someone is sending us, is it really, does it sound reasonable? Does it not sound reasonable? So I would look at those and kind of give my own opinions on it. Another role that I had was I did science communication and user experience and user interface for a microbiome data collaborative at a US government lab. They asked me many times if I was a Russian spy. I many times said that I was not. How did they check? I'm not really sure. Essentially, what I did there was trying to figure out how do I explain pretty complex microbiome data kind of concepts. How do I communicate that in a simple way? And how do we build a dashboard for something that scientists from different disciplines could interact with? I think that was my first experience with really working across different things. So it wasn't the people that I was working with weren't all academics. It was there was a mix of people that were both academic, and they were also didn't have the scientific background, and then they were also people who had a computer science background, and some people that I guess there was just a lot of different people. Some people work in policy, and it was really, really interesting seeing how can we get all of these different stakeholders to speak the same language, or at least speak similar enough language to make sure that they can all communicate. So I found that really fun. At that point, I had some, I guess you would call business experience. I'd had some academic experience. I didn't put on here. I also worked at Stanford on very basic stem cell research as well. So I'd had some academic lab experience as well. And I wanted to try something a bit more, in entrepreneurial. So I applied it wasn't really applied. I reached out to one of the startups that was being incubated out of Berkeley. And I was the third hire at Catena Biosciences. So what Catena does is they or they make really good like protein conjugates that can be made like at stable room temperature. They kind of invented a molecular glue that can work pretty well, and my job was to make and produce some of these proteins and then stick them together. So an example would be they are now making some like breast cancer medication that's very precise, because it can you can attach something that finds a breast cancer cell, and you can attach a toxin to it, and you can attach them together, and that's kind of like the tech of the company. So through that, I figured out, okay, how does working at an early stage startup work? How do you go through like the various like seed funding or like pre-seed, all that kind of stuff? How do you go through the different funding rounds? And I also experienced how does it feel to working on research or wet lab research full time. So how does it feel to like run experiments? How do you kind of like plan your weeks that way? And like what does it look like when they inevitably fail? How do you troubleshoot it? How do you think about that? So I guess at that point I had kind of the summary at this point was that I was just kind of doing very different things and trying to try out small bits of everything, just so I could get a sense of like, okay, what is it like to work in these different areas? So I didn't necessarily have like a very clear path of like, oh, I want to work here. It was more just like, what is an interesting group of people, or what are interesting teams, and then trying to place myself to work with those different teams to get a better sense as to what is going on. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. So another thing that I consistently experienced, and I think sometimes still do, so I was quite frequently the only woman in a particular room that I was in. This was true of like some of the technical spaces that I was in. This was true of some of the EA spaces that I was in. I think it's like, this is not necessarily always the case, but it is something I struggle with. Sometimes I would be on a panel. I was on a panel at Stanford, and I was like the only woman there in existential risk. It's not like a huge, I guess, thing, but I think it's quite sad that like myself as a white woman, I am like the diversity on like a panel like that. So I'm hoping to, I really hope to see this change. Another thing that, I guess at that point I was also taking on a larger role in the UC Berkeley EA. So at that point I was kind of getting more familiar with the concept. I was talking to other students. They were kind of pitching their ideas to me. Like, it was really nice to interact with their like theories of change, of how they would change the world or something like that. Some of them were good, some of them were not less good, but it was really fun to discuss that with other students. So I guess like in general, I really enjoy having like a close core group of friends that you can bounce ideas off of, that kind of get it. So that could be something that, I don't know, I find like fun. And at that point I was also getting more connected within biosecurity and trying to actually understand like what is biosecurity. At this point I will also define what I interpret biosecurity to be, and different people have different kind of definitions. So to my understanding of what biosecurity is how do we prevent pandemics or biological threats that can cause existential risks. So how do we prevent people misusing biology in a way that is still safe, and also still, from my perspective, doesn't necessarily hinder progress, but actually like how do you make progress within biotechnology safe? There are people that have different definitions. There's also, I want to make sure that there's a difference between biosafety and biosecurity. So biosafety sometimes is referred to as when you work in a lab and like you kind of spill something and some blood can like spill on you. That can be defined as biosafety. And then biosecurity is more kind of like the overall, like it's kind of a broader term, which is mostly defined to do with how do we prevent like some of these bigger threats, such as like either man-made pandemics or either natural emerging pandemics that can cause like really kind of like large-scale threats, or deliberate misuse of biology in terms of either bioweapon or something like that. So that's my definition of it. And so this is at around 2022, I got involved with the Bioautomation Challenge. So at that point, I hadn't really written any code. I hadn't really like done anything. I had only done mostly wet lab biology. And I emailed this professor at the Francis Crick Institute called Erica Alden de Benedictis, and I joined, sorry, I'll probably stand this way. So I joined the Bioautomation Challenge with her. So one of the goals of this challenge was, and it's still ongoing, and it's now turned into kind of like a bit of like a pretty big project. So it's thinking about how do we make like laboratory protocols accessible and like uploaded them into the cloud and also make them easily reproducible. So how can we make it reproducible, scalable, and shareable? So like, I guess when you do something in the lab, at least from my experience, there's kind of like sometimes when you join a lab and like you get trained on a technique, you kind of like mess around and you get the technique wrong quite a few times, and then like somehow you kind of figure out your own magical ways of making it work. And then when you have to explain it to another person, like if it's an easier technique, it's quite easy to kind of pass it along, and like you have like the recipe or like the protocol and you have the steps. But then like when another person tries to replicate it, somehow like there's even though they're technically doing the exact same steps as you, there's kind of a number of things that can go wrong, because there's a number of inherent kind of like knowledge points that people have like when they're doing this type of biology stuff. So here, the goal of this is to really like how do we automate this, and how do we make machines do this so they can continuously do this and like not be as error prone as humans. Naturally, there's a lot of challenges with that. So my interest in getting involved with this was because I found working in the lab quite frustrating. Like it was quite annoying. Why am I not using my brain and running this like 12-hour procedure when I could be, like thinking about more large-scale things instead of kind of like basically doing the same thing over and over with my hands to get a result. But I also think that like wet lab is really important to actually like validate the kind of like more theoretical things. So I got involved to kind of like find out more about it, and the kind of my experience with it was like really thinking, okay, if we do upload these things into the cloud, how do we measure access? Like how do we think about who has access to these protocols? Can we have like just anyone have access to any sort of protocol? Is there going to be like different levels of like safety? And how do we think about, okay, like how do we strike the balance between like making it accessible but also making it safe? So that was something I was thinking about. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And at this point as well, I think if you're seeing kind of like me going all over the place in different things and trying different things, I just want to point out that it's kind of like, it's okay if you don't know exactly where you fit in within like effective altruism or like within this kind of space. It took me a while to figure it out, and I think it's like totally okay if it doesn't seem that like there's like a particular linear path that you're following. I think that it like, if you are kind of like diligent about testing uncertainties and like thinking about different types of fit, then eventually it does work out. So I also, I finished my degree and I applied to Charity Entrepreneurship's cohort last year.
Sorry,
yes.
Could you move the 1 meter to that
Yeah.
side or we end up?
That's fine. Is that okay? Yeah. So I finished my degree and I applied to Charity Entrepreneurship. So for those of you that aren't sure what Charity Entrepreneurship is, it's an incubator that launches nonprofits. So it's kind of similar to Y Combinator, but for nonprofits. And they have a number of people apply, and then you go through kind of like a selection process where they ask you about your views on the world, like why you want to do good, or like what does doing good mean to you and why is that important. And then they have a number of ideas that they publish each round. So they have kind of like around 5 to 10 ideas that they publish, and then they take around like 10 to 20 people, and then basically they kind of like get a bunch of people and they get a bunch of ideas and they mix them around and hope that something cool happens. And so I applied and was accepted to this cohort, and I was really, really excited to be in a cohort where they had kind of 2 biosecurity ideas that I was interested in, or biosecurity adjacent. And the 2 ideas that they had, so one of them I ended up founding them, and it was to do with reducing the threat of antimicrobial resistance. So I guess through this cohort, it was really interesting to be. I think this was a really motivating space to be, because it was a space with like 10 other really like motivated, really ambitious people that also wanted to have like an impact, and essentially also learning about like what does founding a nonprofit look like, and thinking about all of these things was really, really interesting. So I guess my current projects and next steps, this kind of brings me to kind of what have I been doing now or since October. So I co-founded ARMA, which is the Alliance for Reducing Microbial Resistance, and previously I was mostly focused on technical work, so I hadn't really done any policy work. So the reason why I was particularly excited to work on this project is because I have never worked with like the EU Commission or the UK government, or like really thought about what does it look like to write a policy brief? How do you pass an idea through government? How do you network with these individuals? What does that look like? So that has been really, really interesting in terms of that. So what ARMA does and what ARMA focuses on is, so antimicrobial resistance is kind of like when you consume antibiotics or when you consume sometimes meat, there's a number of like bacteria in your body that grows resistance to the drugs that we already currently have. So for example, like by 2050, there's a chance that when you go to the doctor and let's say you cut yourself and you have an infection, the drugs that they would usually give you to make it go away or to make it reduce will no longer work. So there's a number of different reasons as to why that's a problem. So there's access. People don't have access to the right antibiotics, or they have unregulated access. So there's some countries where you can kind of go to the doctor and you can basically, like, you only can get them you can only get these antibiotics prescribed to you. There are some countries where you can basically go to the pharmacy and get as much as you want, which ends up either like one person takes too many, or just like the general population takes too many drugs, and that drives resistance in the bacteria. The other thing is yes, the stewardship. So there's issues with kind of access, and there's also like incorrect access itself. So the like people that need access to the kind of like more like expensive, or kind of like they're called the kind of stronger drugs because they're like they have less resistance to them, don't have access to them, and so they end up using tons and tons of the ones that work less well. And then there's also kind of a stagnating innovation in the space because making antibiotics is expensive, and when you make a new antibiotic, it doesn't make sense for you to you're not going to sell a lot of it. So it's kind of, you can see there's a very flawed business model of like, hi, please invest tons and tons of money in making this really complex drug, and then once we make it, please sell it to no one and keep it on the back shelf and make sure that we don't use it. So naturally, that doesn't really incentivize like big pharmaceutical companies to make antibiotics. So in general, this is an issue that I think that I want to also clarify, that I think that my definition of antimicrobial resistance and like my definition of biosecurity, antimicrobial resistance is kind of on the fringe of the kind of biosecurity space and preventing pandemics. I think it's a driving factor, but I don't think it's like one of the biggest risk factors in terms of being an extra. So this is something that is like kind of on the fringes between global health maybe and biosecurity. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about that. Essentially the like nonprofit focuses on the access and the innovation part of this kind of tripod, or the kind of like issues between antimicrobial resistance. And what I do mostly, there's a partnership with Japan that I'm in charge of, which is basically myself talking to the kind of like people, representatives in the Japanese government, and then also with the different think tanks there, and then seeing what policies they do, and then kind of like interfacing with them. Whereas my other co-founders, who actually are full-time on this project, they like go to places such as like Brussels or Geneva and basically try to get certain laws that would be favorable for developing new antibiotics passed. And then the other thing that I kind of spend most of my time on, so I started my PhD at Oxford in October. So the ways that I guess a PhD works, specifically in the UK, is that there is a number of supervisors or a number of professors that can like supervise your work. And what you do is you kind of like email and reach out to some of them before, and you're basically like, hi, I have this work experience, can I do some work with you? And I reached out to one of the professors in immunology, and the way I kind of so the reason why I decided to do a PhD was because in a lot of the work that I was previously doing, I was kind of meeting the barrier of that I couldn't generate my own hypotheses. So I could execute, if somebody gave me some tasks that were kind of like technical, I could execute them on them really, really well, but I wasn't able to come up with interesting new directions or interesting new leads as easily myself on a technical level. So I could do that kind of like maybe in a more like entrepreneurship state of like, okay, who do we contact next? But I wasn't sure like, okay, we have this technical problem, like what is the next step in this technical problem? So I wanted to continue to improve my technical skills. Other things that I wanted to do is I wanted to continue with my improve my computational biology skills, and then I also wanted to get to know more immunology. So currently the kind of like 3 people that supervise my PhD, one of them is an immunologist that has like worked, I guess like he's like a fundamental like wet lab immunologist, and he's also a doctor. The other person is a computational biologist that focuses on genomics and sequencing, and then the third person is also a computational biologist, and she's more junior, so she has more time to kind of like interact with me and help day to day. And I'm just going to reiterate this again. I feel like the kind of like path that I'm presenting sometimes can feel all over the place, but it's basically I'm still like actively in the iterating phase of like, okay, do I prefer technical work? Do I prefer policy work? Do I prefer kind of like engaging with stakeholders, or do I prefer kind of like sitting in a room and only coding the entire day? That's something that I'm still actively figuring out. What do I have a comparative advantage for? What do I have a comparative fit, like better fit for? I know there are some things that I like enjoy a lot more. Okay, for example, like bureaucracy. I don't think I have a particularly strong sense for working within, like if you give me like a 20-page form to fill out, I'm not good at that. But there are some things that I'm unsure about, and so I'm spending time trying to figure that out and essentially like continuing to involve myself in interesting projects. So my current project, and I'll kind of spend a brief amount of time on this. So I think about hepatitis C, and so Azim Ansari, who is the genomics person that supervises this project. So I think about how does the virus, and I look at virus sequencing. So I look at virus sequences and I look at human sequences, and then I also look at, I guess there's some clinical data set of like 7,000 people that I have. So what my job is to do is to kind of like clean up that data, clean up the viral sequencing data, clean up the human data. There's another person that's working on that. And then the clinical data has thankfully already been kind of like cleaned and like passed for like being kind of usable. So then the point or the thing I'm trying to do is, can we draw out any insights between, are there mutations in the virus that affect the clinical outcome? So for example, some people have a higher count of C's and G's. It doesn't really matter what they are, but like, and they for some reason get more liver cancer. And you're like, why does that happen? So then it's kind of like looking into that and continuing exploring those possibilities. And then the kind of broader, like big overarching goal as to why I'm like interested in this is because by learning to understand like how some of these bioinformatics pipelines works, I understand like how the sequencing works, and that's really important for detecting if we have like a novel virus strain or something like that. And then I'm just getting a better sense of like what is the virus, how does it work? You have to understand its structure to understand like how it's affecting the host. And then because you're also looking at human, because there's also that human component, I have to understand like, I guess, human biology and human genetics a lot better to understand like how do these things interplay, and are the conclusions or are the findings that I'm finding actually like real, or is there some sort of confounding variable or some sort of thing that's affecting it? That was just a kind of an overview of like, basically this virus has like different genotypes and it mutates all over the world. So it's kind of like, it has like different prevalences and different forms that it takes across the world. So it's interesting to study that, interesting to understand its dynamics. And then the other thing that I do is I run the Oxford Biosecurity group. So we have a number of cycles, and the point of this is it's basically myself and the other people that set it up. I wish I'd had this group when I started, because if I had a project that was like, if I had a space to work with other people that I was really excited to work on, and if I had a space to hop on and basically work on projects that I found exciting with a group of people that had a similar mindset to me, that would have been really good. So the goal was to essentially set up something that I think, okay, how do we get people to work on projects quickly, to test their fit, and to also not have to quit their full-time job or their full-time study to do this? Because I know that it can be quite daunting to, like when you're transitioning from one place to another, it's kind of like, it can be really daunting to just quit and like do something full-time. So this is something that's kind of a bit more like flexible in that sense. And it's also remote. Okay, so this is just, I will put these up, and we can, if you guys are interested, I can talk about these specifically. So I'm gonna spend less time on this. I think it will be more valuable to talk about, I guess, other things as well. But there's basically just like a brief overview of the types of projects that we do. Here's some more ones that we have. And then like since then we've also worked with, so now we've kind of worked with CEPI and One Day Sooner, which are people, or like I guess like groups that focus on both policy change, and they also work on, essentially like there's kind of like different groups. There's like a think tank that comes to us and they're like, hey, we need to write this policy brief. Do you have some people that can help? Or there's kind of like a more technical team that can come to us and they're like, hey, can you help with this? And do you have people with maybe like a physics background or maybe like more of a computational background? And we try to find kind of like a fit for all of that. And then I think, does anyone have any questions on all of that before? I feel like it's been,
I have many questions. When you did the hepatitis C research, was it on clinical data only or also wastewater?
Yeah, so there's no wastewater that I have right now. I think so because I'm like relatively new in my PhD, basically what they give me is like a relatively very simple problem. They're basically like, okay, here is this tiny little playpen. Can you just make sure that you can like orient yourself in this like small problem and find like essentially someone that has like a lot more years of experience will probably spend maybe like, I don't know, 2 months doing this and they'll be like done. But it's been taking me a lot longer than that to kind of like come up with reasonable conclusions. But there are definitely, if there are like reasonable things that come out of this, there's at least like 3 or 4 more different data sets that like people can look at. And I think that like my current supervisor doesn't look at wastewater, but there are other people that do look at wastewater, like in terms of like at Oxford as well, that I could possibly draw into this. I don't think it'll be as relevant for hepatitis C, but it would be relevant for other viruses as well. Yeah.
Can I ask this antimicrobial resistance?
Yep.
What exactly are you doing there? Because I think it's like a big topic, whether it's in animals, in developing world,
Yeah.
In Britain only, and policy.
Yeah.
Whether we have incentives for doctors to overprescribe or something like that. So what exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. So we focus on advocating for pull incentives. So there's kind of 2 things that there's these things called push incentives. So that's kind of like financial incentives that will guarantee that there's more funding for something in this, for funding for research. So for example, if a government comes in and says, okay, people at this university, here is lots of money, try and like find new drugs. And then there's also kind of like pull incentives, which is incentives that like will incentivize kind of later stages in the clinical pipeline for people to produce the antibiotics themselves. So pull incentives, what kind of the UK has done, the UK has this thing called like a subscription model. It's similar to Netflix in a way. So when you watch Netflix, you pay the same amount every month, regardless of whether you watch 5 movies or 10 movies or 20 movies or you watch none. So the UK has kind of introduced a similar subscription model where they're guaranteeing revenue to different companies. So they're basically saying, hi, AstraZeneca or whoever is like working on this antibiotic, we will pay you X many million per year for the next 10 years. And you have this guaranteed revenue. So it doesn't matter if you sell 1 pill or 0 pills or 10,000 pills, we're going to pay you the same amount. So it gives them a guaranteed revenue, which hopefully then incentivizes them to produce the antibiotic. So the hope or the kind of research behind this is that like passing these types of pull incentives will increase the amount of antibiotics produced, because it will kind of like signal to pharma companies that there is, I guess, like revenue that to be had. A big part of like, I guess what the org also spends time on is actually questioning that basic assumption and doing research just like, okay, do pull incentives actually work? Is that actually the best thing to be doing? What is the cost effectiveness of like passing a pull incentive? And then we provide kind of like policy briefs and like country specific suggestions as well. So I don't have an economics background, but the other people on the team do. So essentially they write like cost benefit analysis, and they also write like ROI, like return on investment, kind of like packets, and then they like for a specific country if the policymakers are interested, and then we're able to present that to them and kind of go from there. Does that answer your question?
So you're working on this part.
Yeah.
For instance, incentives for physicians not to
Yeah. So stewardship, that's not our area at all. The one thing I also want to point out, so like 90% of the burden of this issue will be in LMICs. So an important thing that like basically any law that we pass, we also include an access clause. So we're saying, okay, and not only are we guaranteeing this revenue, like for you company, there's also that if we already kind of like are able to get on the stage or on the platform to pass laws, the thing that we always suggest as well is can you add access clauses if you're like a high income country? Can you add access clauses to your legislation so that like the antibiotics will actually get to where they need to go?
Did someone from the government come to you to provide policy brief, or where the initiative starts?
Yeah, so charity entrepreneurship has links with the UK government. So one of the people that is on their research team worked with the UK government. So I think that there's like some links there in terms of the ideas. So we got connected with the UK government very early on because the UK government has passed this. So now we kind of work with them producing these things. But basically the whole point is it's like the UK is very small. So passing it in one country does relatively little in one space. So it's kind of like, how do you pass similar things or something else that works well in other places or at scale? So the US would be something that would be like a huge thing to pass, but obviously passing anything through US government is a nightmare. So there's other people that also focus on passing similar things or lobbying in the US.
So is it in the agenda of charity entrepreneurship to do similar thinking also in other countries and scale it somehow? If it's possible, it's not too country specific.
Yeah, I think that right now, so the idea that we founded is quite on the edge of what charity entrepreneurship like focuses on. So in general, charity entrepreneurship is very like global health focused. So they're like, okay, we have this vaccine, we want to deliver it, or we have like maternal, like I guess basically like they're very focused on like near-termist concrete issues of like, okay, this is a supply chain issue, fix this, or this is like female birth control like needs to be delivered in this area. So I think that like big, large-scale policy lever thing is kind of a big bet on their side. So I'm not sure if they're going to run more. I guess they're basically kind of waiting to see how we do, if they're going to recommend more ideas like that or not. Yeah. I think I have a few more slides at the end, which will be very brief. But essentially, in general, I guess like when you're getting into any field, this is just kind of the model that I use to think about it, where you kind of hear about a field, then you learn about it, then you have project work, and then you go into full-time work. And the reason why I just wanted to like brainstorm that is essentially some of the things that like that people like, at least I felt that there was a huge gap between me just like learning about it and doing some readings and actually being like able to work on some of these issues full time. So the thing that I would suggest focusing on or like spending a lot of, I guess, trying to find is how do I find those smaller projects to test my fit in a particular area. So like naturally, so ask yourself where you are in this diagram. You don't have to do this, but you can just take like 1 minute to write down the next actionable step. But essentially, what I guess the goal or what the hope is that like you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I actually move along this diagram, and like what will be projects that will allow me to test my fit in different areas. And then this is kind of like a big map that I usually put up about, sorry, it's quite difficult to see on this projector. I can send a link like to people if they need it, but it kind of just puts out a different explanation about the field. So there's kind of like access to sterilization, disease surveillance, like internet search, traffic monitoring. There's kind of like the general kind of area of mitigating infections, and then there's the general area of preventing infections. And there's a lot of different areas that work on that. And obviously you can do work that kind of like works in both as well. Yeah.
It's a great article at Effective Altruism Forum. You should check it.
Yeah, and I'm going to skip this as well. But essentially, I've developed a list of like 15, like less than 15-hour test the fit projects for biosecurity. So if you're curious, it's like, okay, how does it feel like to work in this field, and you don't want to spend, more than 15 hours on something else? Basically, I've figured out kind of like small questions, and I've had other people check them as well. What can you do? Like, how can you get your hands? How can you get stuck in without basically like going anywhere? This can be done from your laptop. So that's another thing that I've kind of worked on. And naturally, obviously, if you want to get more involved, you can try to apply for Oxford Biosecurity Group or other groups like that that kind of work on concrete projects, but obviously are a bit more involved than like just remotely like on your laptop on like one Sunday. Yeah, so those are kind of like some things. I'm not sure if this is, this is just like, I would just usually put up some key areas to enter into right now. I don't think that this is like, and then like some skills that could be required. Like this is just not an exhaustive list, but like people have asked me for like, oh, what are some ideas? I'm sure Alex, who will be speaking after me, will have different ideas about this. So that's why I'm just like, this is just like some general things that I sometimes put up. And I want to also point out that there's kind of like a broad range of skills that are needed for all of these different things. So it doesn't, I think like your background isn't, it doesn't matter. I guess like it's like your background can be like very different. And I think we need a lot of diverse backgrounds. In biosecurity. And then kind of the last few pieces of advice is whatever you're doing or whatever career path you're thinking about is really question if what you're doing is what you want to be doing and not because it looks good or not because somebody else like on the forum or I don't know, so basically like said like this is the career path you should be doing, or like this is the thing you should be following, or like this is the most impactful thing to be doing. Really question like what are your assumptions, what is your theory of change for like thinking about the world. And kind of like what is your like basically like what do you actually want to get out of your own career and like your own next steps, rather than like what someone else thinks that would be the best thing for you to be doing with your time, whether it's a funder or like a friendly peer. And then take time for yourself, and it's okay if you have imposter syndrome. I still struggle with this sometimes. that's the summary. So if like in terms of if you want to get involved, things you can chat to me about is the Test the Fit project, my on-ramps into Biosecurity post. You can apply for OBG for next cycle. And I also am working on some learning paths. If you're like, okay, what is biology? How do I skill up on biology? Like I've written some bioinformatics fundamentals 101. I've also I'm writing like biology concepts and I'm writing biology lab work 101. So those should be like, this one is available now, but the other two will be available in the next like 8 weeks. Yeah, thank you so much.
So thank you, Sofya, very much for your talk. So are there any more questions than which was during the talk?
So for AMR, I'm curious, so I take it you primarily work on AMR because of the sort of skill building aspect, but if you were to sort of steal on the case for AMR being a good focus area also for EAs and potentially for being being a high impact area itself, like what's your sort of thought?
Yeah. So I think that, so for me, I want to identify that primarily I work on it to understand how is it to work in policy, what is it like to interact with these government actors. I think AMR is really important. I think that that's why the main question, I guess it goes back to my earlier point, which is what is your, I guess, like moral belief, or like what do you think is like the biggest risk? For example, if you think that existential risk is something that is like quite likely to happen or has a high probability, you may not want to focus on something that like has a lower existential risk, but is also like a very big problem. So to steel man the case for AMR, I think that it's huge. It affects like pretty much everyone in the world, and it will affect like, so imagine if you're basically going to the doctor and like you cannot have your regular chemotherapy, or you cannot have a regular treatment that you're very used to getting. We've been treating antibiotics as the backbone of our medicine for so many years that we just don't even think about just how it is. Like, I don't know if you get like your teeth, like your wisdom teeth taken out and you just get some antibiotics. Basically, it's like routine procedures that we currently have are not going to be possible if we're continue having resistance to these things. I also think it's like a very interesting technical problem in the sense of like, okay, how do we make, like from a chemistry perspective, I just think it's like fascinating, how do we make new drugs, or how do we make a new class of antibiotics? And there's the people working on that, I think, are like doing really, really interesting technical stuff. And then the other thing is like, I also think it's one of those things where, again, it's a classic problem that's classically outsized in LMICs and is classically caused by, I guess, like global West and like people, like countries with historic power that essentially continuously exacerbates the problem in LMICs. So you can have an outsized impact by working on the problem itself and really focusing on those areas. Yeah. Thanks.
Do you have any idea how to popularize bioinformatics? Because it seems to me that it's not popular among medical students, it's not popular among software engineers. I think that people from natural sciences are best ones, but I don't know how to pitch that it's some important bottleneck here.
Yeah, I think that something that I struggle with, I think that there's kind of like two different things. So understanding the kind of like a common issue that I guess both sides have is that like the biologists assume, oh, the like computational aspect of this is really easy. The biology is so hard, like they don't understand the biology, so like they're never gonna, I see some nods. But basically like the biology is so hard, the computational thing is easy. And then the kind of like computer scientists are like, oh, I could never understand the biology, or like I don't even want to understand, or like I don't understand the biology, just tell me what to do. So then they end up kind of like doing things without really understanding like what it is that they're measuring and what it is that they're doing. So I think that like basically more communication between the two I think would be really useful. But I think that like how to make it more popular, I think that that's kind of like a broader question. I think that I'm not the best person like well placed to speak on that, because I think I'm like relatively new to the space myself. So I think once I continue to have more, like I haven't really successfully like taught anyone else. So until I've like successfully taught someone else, or like it's seen like what issues they encounter from like all the different areas, I don't feel qualified to comment as much. Yeah.
It seems you co-founded or led two organizations. Like,
Mhm.
what did you learn from that? What was the most interesting thing or important thing you think you learned from?
Yeah, I think that the relationship with your co-founders, I think is like, or the relationship you have with the people that you're co-founding with, to me has been so much more important than like kind of like the initial successes that you have as an org. Because I've seen a lot of like orgs that were founded either parallel to us or like at similar times basically consistently fail because they didn't get that part right or didn't invest enough time in that. I think that like that's kind of one learning is basically like investing more time in the co-founder relationship and like really making sure that you like fully trust the team that you're working with. Usually when you're when you're starting something, there's so many different things to do that you don't have the time to check everything else yourself. So you really have to trust your co-founder to call the shots on the specific things and also have very defined responsibilities as to like, okay, this is my area and this is your area, and like I trust you to make decisions within this area, and I'm not going to like, I guess, go behind your back and like check that or something like that because it wastes time and then also like kind of debilitates the relationship itself. And then maybe the other thing is like having very clear priorities and being like, okay, this is our like one goal for this month, or these are our 3 goals for this month, and like sticking to those 3 things and really identifying like what is the most useful thing for us to be working on, because there's always like maybe 10 or 15 or like way more things to be working on. So it's really identifying what are those key things and doing those key things really well, as opposed to kind of like focusing on different things. Maybe the example from OBG is like we're just focusing on running cycles and we're just focusing on improving like the experience for the people going through our program, rather than like basically getting like 10 different partnerships or maybe 20 different partnerships. Like we could be scaling a lot quicker, but we haven't like we've chosen not to do that, just to make sure that we're doing the thing that we're doing like quite well before we actually, and like we actually really understand what it is that we're building before we continue to scale it on a larger scale.
So my another question is one very typical thing in EA community. It's like imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to see that you already have like a lot of experience behind you, but you still struggle with it. Do you have some like strategies how to deal with it?
Yeah, I guess maybe like I'll give us some more context as well. So for example, like I can know a lot of different things, but there are still rooms. For example, I presented the first like bits of the data that I've generated through my PhD to like 3 different or like 4 different professors like about a week ago, and that's kind of like exactly the type of space where I still feel extreme imposter syndrome, because I'm like, here is hepatitis C, and it's like it feels like I'm like a kindergartner explaining something that like is so obvious to them, because the person that like one of the people that was like viewing my research invented one of the medicines that like is now being used like worldwide for this thing. So it definitely feels, it's kind of like there's like feeling the scale of to like how many other people, like it's kind of like, okay, I've learned a lot, but there's still so much more to learn. I think that's kind of like, so one of the suggestions would be basically to reframe it as like, oh, not as like this person is so much more amazing than me or like something else like that, or like so much more qualified. It's really like, oh, I have so much more to learn from these people that I have the privilege of being in this room with. So I think that like for myself, I try to basically think of like, okay, if I am or if I have been given this opportunity, that's really exciting that I do get to be in this room and in this space and learn from the people around me and kind of grow from there. And I think that like also having a strong like, again, network of people that can like support you and help you remember your own achievements, I think is like useful. Yeah.
Are there any more?
What's your favorite fact about Hep C, or something you find fascinating?
I think that's why I put up the map. I think like if you just, it's not even the same virus. Like it's just something we loosely call, like hepatitis C mutates so much that it's just really, if I go back maybe, but I think, yeah. Hopefully, sorry, it's gonna be, yeah. So you can see here, so there's like 6 different genotypes. There's actually now 8 different genotypes, and what a genotype is, or like what a difference is basically like when a virus is like different enough from, when a virus is different enough from another virus, they kind of form their own little like clade or their own little like section. And they, when you sequence it, it looks very different. Like this one these kind of purple ones would look quite different to these blue ones. And then essentially, if you then go to this like kind of world diagram, is basically like people that have a virus in the United States would probably look quite differently and respond to treatment very, very differently to people in this area. And then that would also be different to this area. And then like for some but then like there are also really interesting like historical reasons as to why. So if you actually then basically go back in time and model or like have a look at like where were the trade routes, where were the people moving, like basically like where were the sailors having sex, you can actually see like very similar kind of patterns with the virus, like, and how it like spread and how it like. So I think there's a really, really interesting overlap between, I guess, like biology and like biological evolution, but then also literally just like humans either being dumb or humans being smart. And yeah, I think that it's just it's a really, really fascinating like overlap between like public health and like fundamental biology. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. And if you want to discuss something more in deep, in Sofia there will be office hours from 7 in the room under us here, one floor down.
Excellent.
Yeah, Dexter, just on the right. Thank you
Thanks
very
so
much.
much.